Hey y'all, it's entry number 46 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Nick Chubb, running back, Cleveland Browns. We'll start with the positives with Nick Chubb's fantasy profile. Pure rushing talent. As a pure runner, you can make a case for Nick Chubb being the best running back in the league. Chubb has averaged at least 5 yards per carry in each of his 4 seasons in the NFL, 5.2 yards per carry in 2018, 5.0 yards per carry in 2019, 5.6 yards per carry in 2020, and 5.5 yards per carry in 2021. In addition, during the 2021 season, Chubb had the second most rushing yards, the 6th highest true yards per carry, the 4th highest yards per touch, the 3rd most evaded tackles, the 3rd most runs of 15 or more rushing yards, the 4th most yards created, and the 5th most yards created per touch among running backs according to Player Profiler. He's clearly one of the best rushing talents in the league, which should hopefully translate to fantasy points. The next thing I really like about Nick Chubb's fantasy profile is his offensive line. For the past few seasons, the Cleveland Browns have had one of the best offensive lines in the league. Going into the 2022 season, the Browns are projected to have the second best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus. In addition, they still have the best offensive line coach in the league in Bill Callahan. Having a great offensive line will make it easier for Chubb to be efficient and put up solid fantasy numbers. The third thing I really like about Nick Chubb's fantasy profile is that his head coach, Kevin Stefanski, has a run-heavy offense. Over the course of his career as an offensive play caller, Kevin Stefanski's entire running back room has averaged 25.78 carries per game. For reference, the league average running back room in 2021 averaged just 21.66 carries per game. By having a coach who loves to utilize his running backs on the ground, it makes it more likely that Nick Chubb has a solid workload each game. Moving on to some of the concerns with Nick Chubb's fantasy profile. Receiving workload. Nick Chubb was targeted just 25 times in 2021, with 20 receptions, 174 receiving yards, and 1 receiving touchdown, and just 18 times in 2020, where he had 16 receptions for 150 receiving yards. His best receiving season ever was in 2019, where he caught 36 passes on 49 targets for 278 receiving yards, and he doesn't have nearly the same receiving upside as most of the other top fantasy running backs going around his current ADP. The next concern I have with Nick Chubb's fantasy profile is Cleveland's competitive backfield. The Browns' backfield is one of the most talented ones in the league, with arguably 3 players that could be starting backs on different teams: Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, who averaged 71.6 yards from scrimmage in 2020 and 70.0 yards from scrimmage in 2021, and D'Ernest Johnson, who averaged 5.3 yards per carry on 100 carries. By playing in a backfield with so much talent, the Browns do not need to necessarily give Chubb a bell cow workload on the ground. The third concern I have with Nick Chubb's fantasy profile is the QB uncertainty for the first half of the year. Deshaun Watson is slated to be suspended for the first 6 games of the NFL season. Baker Mayfield was just traded to the Carolina Panthers for a draft pick. Because of this, Jacoby Brissett will likely start for the Browns for at least 6 games of the season. Brissett has served as a starter for 2 seasons in the past, 2017 and 2019 for the Colts. In 2017, Brissett averaged just 17.3 completions on 29.3 passing attempts for 193.6 passing yards and 0.81 passing touchdowns per game. In 2019, he averaged just 18.1 completions on 29.8 passing attempts for 196.1 passing yards and 1.20 passing touchdowns per game, according to Pro Football Reference. With Brissett starting 6 games at least, it's likely that the Browns have more of a subpar offense for about half the season, which means fewer scoring opportunities than we've seen from them in the past 2 years. Some additional thoughts on Nick Chubb's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Nick Chubb finished as the RB7 in standard with 195.3 total fantasy points and 14.0 fantasy points per game. The RB11 in half PPR formats with 205.3 total fantasy points and 14.7 fantasy points per game, and the RB13 in full PPR formats with 215.3 total fantasy points and 15.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Nick Chubb had 1 out of 14 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 14 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 14 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 14 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 3 out of 14 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 14 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Past injuries. During the 2021 season, Chubb suffered a calf injury and a rib injury, according to Draft Sharks. In 2020, Nick Chubb had an MCL sprain that caused him to miss 4 games. He also had a gruesome knee injury where he dislocated it and had 3 ligament tears back in his college career. In 2020, Nick Chubb finished as the RB9 in standard leagues, the RB9 in half PPR leagues, and the RB11 in full PPR formats according to Fantasy Pros. This was with him missing 4 games. On a per-game basis during the 2020 season, he ranked 6th in standard, 7th in half PPR, and 9th in full PPR among running backs. In 2020, Chubb posted a broken tackle percentage of 25.3%, had 65.8% of his yards after contact, and averaged 3.7 yards after contact per play. In addition, he had 14 breakaway runs, the second most in the NFL, and created 3.15 yards per touch, the best among running backs according to Player Profiler. Personal opinion. As of early July 2020, Nick Chubb was going off the board as RB14, about pick 29 overall on ESPN, and RB8, about pick 12 overall on Yahoo. Chubb to me is a player that embodies why it's important to know your scoring settings and which site you're drafting on. He's a player you should like in standard scoring settings, but in PPR formats, he doesn't quite have the same upside and is more of a high-end RB2. Looking at the draft websites, I think he's a solid value on ESPN, but I'm not touching him at his current Yahoo ADP, despite him being one of my favorite players in the NFL. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Nick Chubb has a cereal called Chubb Crunch that has a portion of the proceeds going to First Candle, an organization committed to ending sudden infant death syndrome and other sleep-related infant deaths. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.